The angry cleric who wrote a masterpiece. Welcome. I am Melesias. Today, we are embarking on a journey. A journey across vast, uncharted oceans, to strange and fantastical lands, where men are 6 inches tall, where giants tower over us like gods, where islands float in the sky, and where horses speak with the voice of pure reason. But this is not merely a children's story. It is a mirror. A dark, distorted, and deeply unsettling mirror, held up to our own world by one of the most brilliant and furious minds in the history of English literature. We are opening Gulliver's Travels by Jonathan Swift. Jonathan Swift was an Anglo-Irish clergyman, a political pamphleteer, and a man possessed of a righteous, devastating anger. He was appointed Dean of St. Patrick's Cathedral in Dublin, a position that gave him a pulpit from which to observe the follies and cruelties of his age. He was a friend of the great poets and politicians of his day, yet he always felt like an outsider, a man caught between 2 nations, who loved humanity in the abstract but found its individual members to be a source of constant disappointment and fury. He was a master of irony, a man who could say the most savage things with the most perfectly straight face. And he was a tireless defender of the poor and the oppressed, using his pen as a weapon against the greed of the powerful and the hypocrisy of the religious establishment. In 1726, Swift published a book under a pseudonym, a travelogue that purported to be the true account of a ship's surgeon named Lemuel Gulliver. It was an instant sensation, devoured by everyone from the highest lords to the lowest servants. It was read aloud in drawing rooms and discussed in coffee houses. But what the first readers found in its pages was not just a thrilling adventure. It was a savage, unrelenting, and deeply personal attack on the very foundations of their society. The political parties, the religious squabbles, the scientific pretensions, the military glory, the philosophical arrogance of the Enlightenment. Swift took them all and, with a surgeon's cold precision, cut them open to reveal the rot beneath. So, let us set sail with Mr. Gulliver. Let us leave behind the solid, rational shores of England and enter a world of wonders. But as we travel, let us keep our eyes open. For beneath the giants and the floating islands, the mad scientists and the talking horses, there is a question that Swift is asking us. A question that is as urgent and uncomfortable today as it was 3 centuries ago. What, he asks, is a human being, really? A creature of reason, or a creature of appetite? A noble soul, or a dangerous, violent, and greedy animal? Let us begin our first voyage. Let us journey to the land of the little people. Let us journey to Lilliput. Part 1, Lilliput, a giant among pygmies. The first voyage of Lemuel Gulliver began, as so many of his adventures would, in disaster. His ship, the Antelope, was driven off course by a violent storm in the South Seas and wrecked upon a jagged reef. Gulliver, a strong swimmer, managed to struggle through the crashing waves and drag himself onto a sandy shore. Exhausted beyond measure, he collapsed. And when he awoke, he found that he could not move. His arms, his legs, his very hair were pinned to the ground by thousands of tiny, almost invisible threads. The sun was beating down, and he could feel a million small, busy things crawling over his body. He heard a thin, high-pitched chattering all around him. And then, a small, perfectly formed human being, no taller than his middle finger, armed with a tiny bow and arrow, climbed onto his chest and stood looking down at him. This was Gulliver's introduction to the empire of Lilliput, a kingdom of people who stood no more than 6 inches tall. Their first reaction to the giant in their midst was, understandably, one of terror and awe. They debated long and hard about what to do with this strange, monstrous creature. But Gulliver, who was a gentle and honest man at heart, communicated his peaceful intentions through gestures. And so, the Lilliputians, with their characteristic ingenuity, devised a plan. They built a vast, complex wooden carriage, pulled by 1,500 of their finest horses, and transported the sleeping giant to their capital city of Moldendo. There, they housed him in an ancient, disused temple, the only structure large enough to accommodate him, though he had to crawl through the door on his hands and knees. They fed him prodigiously, delivering baskets of tiny bread loaves and entire herds of miniature cattle, which Gulliver would swallow whole, much to the amazement of the assembled crowds. The Emperor of Lilliput, a man of immense pride and a fine, princely bearing, was fascinated by Gulliver. He saw in the giant a potential weapon, an ultimate trump card in his nation's long and bitter war against their mortal enemies, the Blefuscudians. And what was the cause of this great and terrible conflict? It was not land, nor gold, nor honor, but a single, irreconcilable question of religious doctrine, at which end should a boiled egg be cracked. The Lilliputians, by royal decree, cracked their eggs at the smaller end. The Blefuscudians, following an ancient and heretical text, cracked theirs at the larger end. This theological schism had led to decades of war, thousands of deaths, and a hatred so deep that it consumed both nations. Swift's satire of the religious wars between Catholics and Protestants that had torn Europe apart for over a century was as sharp as a razor, and it was hidden in plain sight within a ridiculous argument about a breakfast food. Gulliver became the hero of Lilliput when he performed an extraordinary feat of strength. The Blefuscudian fleet, a vast armada of tiny warships, was anchored in the harbor, preparing for an invasion. Gulliver, wading into the water, attached hooks to all 50 ships and, with a single, mighty pull, dragged the entire enemy fleet back to the shores of Lilliput. He was awarded the highest honor in the land, the title of Nardak, and was celebrated by the entire court. But his glory was short-lived. The Lilliputian court was a nest of vipers, a place of petty rivalries, backstabbing, and dark conspiracies. Two powerful ministers, the High Admiral Skyresh Bolgolam and the High Treasurer Flimnap, became his bitter enemies. Flimnap, with a logic that was both absurd and terrifying, accused Gulliver of secretly being a drain on the empire's economy, because the cost of feeding the giant was bankrupting the nation. Bolgolam spread a rumor that Gulliver was having a secret affair with the emperor's wife, a suspicion that led to a charge of high treason. The articles of impeachment against Gulliver were a masterpiece of political hypocrisy. He was charged with treason, with urinating in public. He had, in an emergency, put out a fire in the empress's chambers in a most unconventional manner, and with refusing to utterly annihilate the Blefuscudian people, which the emperor demanded. The sentence, driven by the vengeful Bolgolam, was the cruelest imaginable. They would not, and could not, kill the giant. Instead, they planned to put out his eyes, starve him slowly, and then dispose of his body. A kind friend in the court warned Gulliver of the plot, and the giant, with a heavy heart, made a difficult decision. Rather than face a horrific punishment for crimes he did not commit, he would flee. He waded across the channel to Blefuscu, where he was welcomed as a hero. He found a drifting, full-sized boat, repaired it, and set sail for home. The first of his extraordinary journeys had come to an end. And the taste of human folly it had left in his mouth was a bitter one. Part 2, Brobdingnag, a pygmy among giants. Gulliver had not learned his lesson. The sea, with its promises of fortune and its cold, indifferent cruelty, called to him once more. He signed on for a second voyage, this time aboard a ship called the Adventure. An adventure, of a most terrifying and humiliating kind, was exactly what he found. A violent storm blew the ship far off course, and a landing party, including Gulliver, was set upon by a band of colossal, monstrous savages. Gulliver's companions fled in terror back to the ship's longboat, leaving him behind. He ran, his heart pounding, into a vast field of what he at first took to be trees, but which were, in fact, gigantic stalks of corn. He was no longer a giant. He was an insect. He had entered the land of Brobdingnag, a kingdom of people who stood over 60 feet tall. His first encounter was with a colossal, terrifying reaper, a giant with a voice like thunder, who nearly crushed him underfoot. Gulliver screamed for his life, and the giant, startled, picked him up and examined him like a curious insect. He was taken to the farmer's house, where he was displayed like a fascinating, exotic pet. The farmer's cat, a monster the size of 3 oxen, purred with a sound like a dozen weaving looms. The rats were the size of large dogs and attacked him with a ferocity that nearly ended his story then and there, forcing Gulliver to draw his cutlass and fight for his life. But the most terrifying creature in the house was the farmer's 9-month-old baby, who, upon seeing the tiny, shiny creature, grabbed Gulliver with a vice-like grip and tried to shove him, whole, into its enormous, slobbering mouth. Gulliver was saved only by his desperate screams. The farmer, a shrewd and greedy man, saw an opportunity. He turned Gulliver into a spectacle, a traveling freak show. He was paraded through the towns and villages of Brobdingnag, performing exhausting tricks, answering ridiculous questions, and being gawked at by crowds of giants, until his health began to fail. The farmer, seeing that the golden goose was about to die, sold him to the Queen of Brobdingnag for a vast sum of money. The queen was fascinated by the tiny, articulate creature and treated him with a gentle, if somewhat condescending, curiosity. The king, however, was a different matter. He was a scholar, a philosopher, a man of immense learning and deep insight. And after listening to Gulliver's proud, patriotic descriptions of his homeland, of the English Parliament, the legal system, the military glory, the religious tolerance, the King of Brobdingnag looked at him with a mixture of pity and disgust. He asked Gulliver a long series of probing, devastating questions. And then, he delivered his verdict. He took Gulliver in his hand, stroked him gently, and said, "I cannot but conclude the bulk of your natives to be the most pernicious race of little odious vermin that nature ever suffered to crawl upon the surface of the earth." Gulliver, stung by this insult to his national pride, spent the next 2 years in a gilded cage. He lived in a specially constructed traveling box, a small, beautiful, and comfortable prison. He had a tiny bed, tiny chairs, a tiny table. He dined with the queen, conversed with the king, and lived a life of unparalleled luxury. And yet, he was still a pet, a plaything, a fragile, pathetic creature whose very existence depended on the whims of beings who could crush him by accident. His escape, when it finally came, was as random and absurd as everything else in his life. A giant eagle, hunting for prey, swooped down on his traveling box, seized it in its talons, and carried it high into the air. It flew for miles, then, attacked by other eagles, dropped the box into the sea. Gulliver, locked inside his tiny prison, listened to the waves crashing against the walls. He was rescued by a passing English ship. His second voyage was over. Part 3, Laputa, Balnibarbi, and the Struldbrugs, the Madness of Reason. Gulliver had barely recovered from his ordeal in Brobdingnag when the sea called to him once more. This time, however, his ship did not meet a storm. It met pirates. He was set adrift in a small canoe, and after days of desperate, lonely sailing, he found himself rescued not by a ship, but by something far stranger. A shadow fell over him, blotting out the sun. He looked up and saw a solid, circular island of rock, a flying island, hovering directly above him. A long rope ladder was lowered, and Gulliver, bewildered and terrified, climbed up into the kingdom of Laputa. The inhabitants of Laputa were a race of men unlike any Gulliver had ever encountered. They were intellectuals, completely and utterly absorbed in abstract thought. Their heads were tilted perpetually to one side, and one of their eyes was turned inward, lost in contemplation, while the other was fixed blankly on the sky. Their clothing was covered in strange, mystical diagrams, suns, moons, stars, and complex geometric shapes. They were so profoundly lost in their own minds that they were completely oblivious to the world around them. They had no interest in conversation, in human connection, or in any practical matter whatsoever. They required special servants, called flappers, who carried large, inflated bladders filled with dried peas. The flapper's only job was to walk behind his master and, when he needed to be brought back to reality to speak or to listen, to strike him gently on the mouth or the ear with the bladder. This, Swift suggests with his most devastatingly straight face, was a perfectly reasonable system. Their entire civilization was built on abstract sciences, most notably mathematics and astronomy, and a strange, impractical form of music. Their houses were poorly built because their architects despised practical geometry. Their clothes never fit because their tailors, instead of using a measuring tape, used a quadrant, compass, and other astronomical instruments to take measurements from the stars. The food they served Gulliver was cut into the shapes of geometric figures, a loin of mutton shaped like an equilateral triangle, a piece of beef like a rhomboid, and a pudding like a cycloid. The cuisine was, Gulliver noted, profoundly unsatisfying. The men of Laputa, for all their intellectual grandeur, were prisoners of their own minds. And the most striking manifestation of their power was the very island on which they lived. The king of Laputa controlled the land below, a continent called Balnibarbi, through a terrifyingly simple form of aerial tyranny. If any city below dared to rebel or refuse to pay its taxes, he would simply order his island to float over that city and hover there, blocking out the sun and rain, a silent, hovering apocalypse, until the rebels were starved into submission. Gulliver, bored and increasingly disgusted by the inhabitants of Laputa, requested permission to descend to the continent below, to see the land that was ruled by this strange, intellectual tyranny. What he found in Balnibarbi was even more disturbing. He visited the Grand Academy of Lagadu, a sprawling, chaotic institution that was the brainchild of a group of projectors, or mad scientists. Here, genius had been completely untethered from common sense. He saw a professor who was trying to extract sunbeams from cucumbers. Another was working on reducing human excrement back to its original food. A third was teaching a class of students a method of writing books on any subject by randomly combining words written on a large, rotating mechanical frame. The entire academy was a monument to human folly, a place where intelligence, divorced from all practical purpose, produced nothing but absurdity and waste. It was a savage, and hilarious, satire of the Royal Society and the unthinking worship of scientific progress. The most haunting and profound experience of his third voyage, however, was not a place, but a race of people. In the kingdom of Lugnag, Gulliver learned of the Struldbrugs, a rare group of individuals who were born with a mark on their foreheads and were condemned, or perhaps blessed, with immortality. Gulliver, upon hearing this, was ecstatic. He launched into a passionate, detailed fantasy of what he would do if he were immortal. He would acquire immense wealth, amass all the knowledge in the world, and become a living treasure of wisdom and guidance. But the Lugnagians who were listening to him simply laughed. They explained to him the terrible truth about the Struldbrugs. They did not have eternal youth. They had eternal old age. They continued to grow older, frilier, more senile, and more decrepit with each passing century. They lost their teeth, their hair, their memories, their sense of taste and smell. They were legally declared dead at the age of 80, but they continued to live on, a horrifying spectacle of decay, unable to die, a living proof that the fear of death is, in its way, a gift. The desire for endless life, Swift suggests, is the most foolish desire of all. Part 4, The Land of the Houyhnhnms, the Horses of Reason and the Human Beast. Gulliver's fourth and final voyage was not born of a desire for adventure, but of a quiet, creeping despair. He had returned from his previous journeys a changed man, increasingly disgusted by the society he had once proudly defended. The offer of captaining a ship was a means of escape, a way to flee from a species he was beginning to loathe. But fate, as it always did with Gulliver, had other plans. His crew mutinied, seized the ship, and abandoned him on a strange, unknown shore. It was a land of gentle, rolling pastures, dotted with neat, orderly groves of trees. It seemed, at first, a paradise. But he soon discovered it was a paradise where the natural order of things had been terrifyingly, and perhaps righteously, inverted. The first creatures he encountered were a band of savage, hairy, and terrifying humanoids. They were filthy, with matted hair, long, dirty nails, and faces contorted with an ugly, brutish aggression. They screamed, howled, and threw their own excrement at him. They were called Yahoos. Gulliver was horrified, but he also felt a strange, unsettling sense of recognition. Then, suddenly, the Yahoos scattered in terror. Approaching them was a horse. But it was not a horse in the sense Gulliver understood it. It was a creature of immense dignity, grace, and intelligence. Its coat was smooth, its movements were elegant, and its eyes held a calm, thoughtful, and deeply rational light. It was a Houyhnhnm. The word, in their language, means, the perfection of nature. The horse was the master. The Yahoo was the beast of burden. The rational animal was not man. The rational animal was the horse. Gulliver was taken to the home of the Grey Horse, who became his master, and was introduced to the Houyhnhnm society. It was a civilization built entirely on reason. The Houyhnhnms had no concept of lying, of evil, of greed, of lust, or of any of the complex, destructive emotions that consume human beings. They governed their lives according to two simple, guiding principles: friendship, a universal, calm benevolence towards all members of their species, and reason, an unshakable, collective common sense. They had no word for opinion, because any question could be calmly and rationally debated until the single, correct answer was found. They had no word for war, because they saw no possible rational justification for mass slaughter. They had no word for law, because they did not need one. Their society was a perfect, harmonious machine, and the language they spoke was the language of pure logic. When Gulliver, in an attempt to explain his own world, described the profession of a soldier, the Houyhnhnm master could not comprehend it. When Gulliver described lawyers, politicians, and priests, the master was even more baffled. But when Gulliver described the European nobility and the wars they waged for their glory, the master fell into a long, thoughtful silence. And then he said, simply, that he had, until now, believed that the Yahoos were the most pernicious race upon the earth. Gulliver lived among the Houyhnhnms for 5 years. He learned their language, adopted their customs, and slowly, painfully, began to see himself and his own species through their eyes. He came to believe that the Yahoo was not just a separate, savage race. It was a mirror. A dark, distorted, and terrifyingly accurate reflection of the human animal beneath the thin veneer of civilization. He saw his own face in a pool of water and recoiled in disgust, believing himself to be a Yahoo. And yet, he was not one of them. He was something in between, a creature of two worlds, belonging to neither. The Houyhnhnms, in their perfect, rational order, eventually held a great assembly to debate the Yahoo question. Their logic was as cold and precise as a mathematical proof. The Houyhnhnm master argued passionately for Gulliver, a Yahoo who had been given a spark of reason. But the assembly's verdict was clear and absolute. Gulliver, being a Yahoo, no matter how civilized, posed an inherent threat to their perfect society. He must leave. The verdict was a death sentence, and Gulliver, with a grief that was almost unbearable, was forced to obey. He built a canoe, said goodbye to his master, and sailed away from the only truly rational, and truly terrifying, paradise he had ever known. Gulliver was rescued, against all odds, by a Portuguese ship and returned to England. But he was a broken man. His 5 years among the Houyhnhnms had not enlightened him. They had shattered him. He could no longer bear the sight, the smell, or the company of his fellow human beings. He saw in every face the shadow of a Yahoo, the lurking, savage, irrational beast. He spent his days in his stable, talking to his 2 horses, whose simple, honest smell was the only balm for his wounded soul. He could not even bear the touch of his own wife and children. The book ends not with a triumphant return, but with a quiet, devastating scene of a man sitting alone in a stable, having seen too much, unable to forget the perfection he has lost and the truth about himself. Jonathan Swift, the angry, brilliant Dean of St. Patrick's, did not write a happy ending. He wrote a warning. Gulliver's Travels is not a misanthropic scream of hatred, but a profound, desperate, and deeply wounded plea. He held up a mirror to humanity, and what he saw in that mirror was not the noble, rational creature of the Enlightenment, but a dangerous, violent, and deeply flawed animal. And yet, his very act of writing the book, of trying to awaken us to our own follies, is proof that he believed we could be better. The tragedy of Gulliver is that he could not find a middle ground. He could not accept the messy, complicated, imperfect truth of what it means to be human. And in that, perhaps, lies the final, and most important, lesson of this extraordinary book. I am Melesias. This has been the story of Gulliver's Travels, as I have understood it. Thank you for listening. If this journey through wonder and horror has moved you, please subscribe. And the next time you look in a mirror, ask yourself, what do you see? A creature of reason, or a Yahoo? Until next time.